Mic check, mic check. Mic check, mic check, mic check, mic check, mic check, mic check, mic check. Mic check, mic check. Mic check, mic check. Mic check, mic check. Mic check, mic check.
Check 1 2, check 1 2 3. Can you hear that, Dom? Check 1 2. I'm talking into the mic at a. Oops, we just got disconnected there. Okay. Just happened there.
Hey, Doug, can you hear me from the platform? Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
I can hear you from the platform. It looks like we got disconnected on the phone. Are you hearing me okay?
I am. I'm hearing you loud and clear. You sound great.
All right, so are we good with audio?
We are good to go. If the level's good in the room, then we are happy.
Okay, and Larry's good?
Larry's good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Bye-bye.
Okay. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in this hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. I see we've got a number already. And as with in-person hearings, members and witnesses are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Those joining remotely should keep themselves muted unless recognized by the chair and should expeditiously unmute themselves when recognized. Finally, members experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately and we'll try to help. Good morning and thank you all for joining this hybrid hearing. This hearing is entitled Tackling the Tax Code, Evaluating Fairness, Efficiency, and Potential to Spur Inclusive Economic Growth. I thank the witnesses for being here. Again, you're going to see members come in and off remotely and in person. There's a lot going on, so don't be flummoxed by that. A lot of people are paying attention and have questions that they want to ask. With that, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. And let me say thank you again to our witnesses. I'm hoping what we can achieve today as a committee on economic disparity is a really fact-based and truth-oriented examination of the tax code. I hope that we can dispel some of the politics and the political rhetoric, which is not always accurate, so that we can really consider whether our tax code is efficient and fair. Out of this hearing, obviously, will come proposals to try to address areas where there are inefficiencies or inequities. I'd like to just start by maybe dispelling some of the typical concerns about the tax code. One, in preparation for this hearing, because I live in a political world, I was stunned to learn that relative to all other industrialized countries, Americans are actually relatively lightly taxed. We are taxed less than the Germans, the Italians, the Austrians, the Swiss, the Estonians, the Canadians. I could go on and on. We do pay slightly higher taxes than the Turks, the Mexicans, and the Chileans. That is not a call for higher taxes. It is simply a fact. And while I understand that putting facts into Congress is like spitting into a hurricane sometimes, I think it is important that we start with facts and analysis. Second, the tax code in its aggregate is a progressive tax code. If you make more money, you generally pay more taxes. I think that there's broad agreement under the principle that to whom much is given, much is expected, that that's a good thing. What's interesting, though, about the code, and we're going to get into this, is that it actually ceases to be progressive at the very top of the income distribution. And the reason for that, of course, is that the very, very wealthiest in this country make their income not from the sweat of their brows, not by getting up and punching a clock every day, but by collecting capital gains, interest, and dividend. And if you look at the top 1% of the 1% in this country, at that point, the tax code ceases to be progressive in a way I think that violates a basic sense of fairness that most Americans have. When Warren Buffett memorably came up with the Buffett rule, he said, hey, why am I, as one of the richest men in America, paying a lower effective tax rate than my secretary? Warren Buffett obviously works hard, but he makes his money from capital gains, income, and dividends. His secretary is punching a clock and making income from the sweat of her labor. You could say that the notion that somebody who is living on the dividends and interest of the fortune made by their parent, for example, ought to at least pay the same taxes as those of us who go to work every day. And I hope we spend some time on that issue. So why is that true? One of the reasons we see that lack of progressivity at the very top of the tax code is that we have chosen, primarily in 2003, to create preferential tax rates for yields on capital, dividends, interest, and capital gains. Today, the top rate on dividends, interest, and capital gains, most Americans don't get these things, is 20%, whereas the top marginal tax rate on working for a living is 37%. Why is that? The argument that we hear is that that's a good idea, even though it may offend a sense of fairness, because that will lead to more investment, which leads to more economic growth, and therefore everybody does better if we tax interest, dividends, and capital gains less than we tax those of us who work every day for a living. The problem with that is that it's just not clear that that is true. And I know that we're going to hear from Dr. Gale, but in his testimony, he points out that the differentiation between taxation on the yields from capital, from money as opposed to labor, had very little impact on investment. So if we're taxing $1 of dividends less than we're taxing the work that we do every day, or more importantly, the work that Americans do every day when they go to work in that store or that factory, and we're not achieving any extra economic growth, why do we do that? And I would just note, just to give a sense for what the implications of this are, that the income that we give up on the capital gains associated with the top 1% of the economic distribution in this country would fully pay for a year of child tax credit. So that's a choice. We could either give money to the child tax credit, which has been shown to be one of the most powerful alleviators of poverty, which I think is germane to what this committee's mission, or we can continue to give preferential capital gains rate to the top 1% of this population without an obvious economic rationale. I also want to look at the tax expenditures. I'm a beneficiary of the mortgage interest tax deduction. I'm a beneficiary of the fact that I don't pay taxes on the value of my health insurance. Many of these things that we call tax expenditures, that is to say subsidies, go to people who have mortgages and therefore are homeowners, go to people who are taxpayers, an income taxpayer, therefore are in the upper stretches of the income distribution. I hope we take a hard look at those tax expenditures, because I think we would agree that if the government is going to give subsidy and benefit, it probably should be to those people who need it and will use it and for whose marginal dollar is very, very valuable. So again, I thank our witnesses. I'm looking forward to a good hearing and a good discussion. I know we're going to get that, and with that, I'll recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Busy day, 3 hearings in one day. I know we share the committee work on financial services as well as this committee, so I appreciate you holding today's hearing. We've been living under one-party Democratic control for a little over a year, and the results are pretty darn concerning. Inflation is at 8.6%. American families are paying $433 a month more than they were before the start of the administration. That's $5,200 a year. Folks are getting clobbered with rising costs, and our poorest communities are being hit the hardest. Prior to the pandemic, the Trump tax cuts created real economic growth. Prior to the pandemic, low-income families saw their net worth increase 37%. Real wages increased 2.9%. Median household income, in particular, improved the most for some of the least amongst us. Real wages were increasing prior to the pandemic. They're falling now. But prior to the pandemic, above the average, above the median, were Hispanics, blacks, Asians, women, veterans. Now we see the opposite. We see real wages falling for all Americans, even at a higher rate for the least amongst us. Never has a juxtaposition of policy been so stark and been so clear. Having seen the results, I believe the Trump tax cuts need to be made permanent. And soon we'll be having a conversation here on Capitol Hill about extending these tax reforms. And I hope my Democratic colleagues will work with us to keep these reforms in place, because we should be working to ensure that the tax code remains simple, fair, and rewards hardworking Americans. A lot's changed under the new administration, driven in part by the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. The $1.9 trillion stimulus bill changed tax policy in particular by no longer expecting work and expanding handouts. And the results kneecapped the economic recovery from COVID. A fully refundable child tax credit removed the expectation for work. In America, there's a proven path to success that people can follow to reach the middle class. If you finish high school, if you work full-time, and if you're married before you have your first child, there's a 97% chance you'll not live in poverty. It's called the success sequence. Our tax code should work to encourage it, and definitely not discourage it. Since the 1990s, Congress has increased spending by 80% to address poverty. But the massive new spending has not massively decreased poverty. The U.S. government authorizes almost $300 billion a year to help low-income families. This funding includes the Earned Income Tax Credit and refundable portions of the child tax credit. The Democrats' Build Back Better tax proposals are poorly targeted and do not enable upward mobility. The fully refundable child tax credit turned a worker's credit into a child allowance, undermining the connection to work. The unintended consequences of these policies are being seen today. Families were flooded with stimulus payments, but were disconnected from proposals that encouraged work. Massive wealth transfers can move people above the poverty line. That's not debated. But it does not move low-income families sustainably into the middle class. These policies have truly failed to move low-income families up and into the middle class in a sustainable way. Our tax code should be built to reward work. We should mirror our tax policies to encourage the success sequence in a simple way. Again, success sequence, finishing high school, getting a full-time job, and getting married before your first child's born. When this path is followed, as I said, 97% of families will not find themselves in poverty. It needs to help bring these to the bottom, to middle class, not keep them near poverty. That should be one of our key goals. And so where do you go from here? I think the key here is to make the tax cuts permanent that gave us the economic growth prior to the pandemic. And I think we have a real opportunity, Mr. Chairman, in particular in a nonpartisan way, to really explore how the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit can be connected. And I believe there needs to be a connection in particular to work. Americans should have fair, simple, low taxes. They should reward work, promote opportunity. I know we're going to have a robust conversation on the topic today. I appreciate you holding today's hearing. Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I thank the ranking member, my friend, and very much look forward to working with him on those issues around child tax credit. And I hope he'll work with me on creating a tax code that, in fact, rewards work rather than the collection of dividends. With that, before we turn to our witnesses, I ask for unanimous consent to play a video from a variety of Americans who are sharing their experiences as part of the committee's mission to show America to itself. We start every hearing with just the voices of the people who are out there because we think that that's really important. So if I've got UC, we'll just run the video, please.
I do have 5 children. And since my husband is in the military, I take care of everything that has to do with the home. I also run my own business. What does the child tax credit mean to me?
Mucho, 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 sinceramente, porque el quedarnos sin trabajo nos ayudó para pagar los biles que teníamos atrasados, como el gas, la luz, y lo poco que nos quedó fue para comida.
Well, I make $600 every 2 weeks, so that money was a blessing for me. Clothing, medicines, glasses. I bought her some shoes because her feet are growing. I bought her clothes. I'm buying her food. So for me, that was a big help. And believe me, there's families out there that they're trying what they can. The single mothers that are working, and they're working in a bakery, and they're working like at cleaning homes as best as they could, even during this pandemic. I see how hard they work. They get 2 jobs, 3 jobs just to sustain their family. These are the people that are earning the least and doing the most. So they're the ones that are cleaning the homes, cleaning the facilities. They were the ones that were hired to do everything that everyone else doesn't want to do is what our community is doing. We need to take care of our citizens, everyone that is living amongst us. We all need to help each other out.
We're a small coffee shop. We serve award-winning coffee. That's it. The current federal tax code is a mess. So in essence, we are penalized if we have a great year in business, which is filed on the Schedule C, for not knowing that we were going to have a great year. There's a penalty that we didn't pay in enough to the government, and we should have known that we were going to do well. We pay along the way. We're not penalized if we have an awesome year and at the end they say, well, you owe $10,000 in tax, you didn't properly plan, you didn't pay in enough, so here's a penalty plus interest. Now looking at the end of each month, yes, it takes additional hours. So when I sit down to do the payroll returns every month and the payroll checks, it's now additional time spent to figure out what am I supposed to be paying the government, how much, at what timing, am I going to be penalized if I'm late, just to hopefully make that whole picture by the end of the year.
Thank you again. Now, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we will hear from Dr. William Gale, who is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and Co-Director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. Next, we have Professor Dorothy Brown, Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law School. Next, we have Mr. Seth Hanlon, the Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Amy Matsui, Director of Income Security and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. And lastly, we have Dr. Angela Rashidi, Senior Fellow and Rose Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you all for being here today. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer directly in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I ask that you be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, to quickly wrap up your testimony so we can respect the time of other witnesses and committee members. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Gale, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today. My testimony represents my own views, not those of any organization. My testimony makes 2 main points. First, there is an enormous amount of evidence indicating that tax cuts in general and tax cuts for high-income households in particular have not had very big impacts on the growth rate of the economy over time. This evidence spans different periods of time, different countries, and different types of taxes, and I'll walk you through that in just a second. Second, in the U.S. today, there are several auspicious ways to raise taxes on high-income households without hurting the economy. These include taxing capital gains at death, repealing the Section 199A deduction for non-corporate business income that was passed in 2017, converting the estate tax to a tax on inheritance, and raising funding for the Internal Revenue Service. There's a third point which I won't talk about, but which is sort of a theme of this hearing, which is that if the revenues from these tax changes were used to fund new support and new opportunities for disadvantaged people, the result would be a significant and lasting reduction in economic disparities and actually a boost in the size of the economy, not a reduction. So first, by way of background, when I talk about the growth rate of the economy, I'm not talking about economic stimulus. It's obvious that tax cuts can stimulate the economy in the short run. What I'm talking about is the medium and term and long-term capacity of the economy to create goods and services. So this might take the form of more labor supply, more capital, more infrastructure, better technology, et cetera. And what I want to do is highlight 3 sets of evidence, sort of vignettes on taxes and the growth rate of the economy. The first one is based on U.S. history. Between the Civil War and the First World War, federal taxes were 2% of the economy, and the growth rate of the economy was 2% per person per year. All right. Move forward to after the Second World War, 1950 to now, federal taxes are now 18% of the economy, 9 times as much as before, but the growth rate is still almost exactly the same, 2% per person per year. Also, during this post-war period, tax rates across the board were higher than in the before World War I period. This income taxes, corporate taxes, payroll taxes, estate taxes. And again, the level of revenue was 9 times as high as a share of the economy, but the growth rate was the same. Now, to be clear, a lot of factors affect the economy, but if taxes matter as much as we've been told, we would surely see a difference in the growth rate from taxes at 18% of GDP versus taxes at 2% of GDP. The second piece of evidence comes from looking across countries and tells a similar story. As the chairman mentioned, the United States has lower taxes than other countries. Our policies also embody less redistribution on the tax and spending side than other countries. If lower taxes and less redistribution help the growth rate, the U.S. should be growing faster than these other countries. Yet, over the past 50 years, taxes at all levels of government were 1/3 higher as a share of GDP in the other G7 countries than in the U.S., but the growth rate per person was virtually identical. The third set of evidence comes from the effects of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. In a recent paper, I looked at the effects of TCJA through the end of 2019 before COVID affected the economy. The results show several things. First, TCJA caused revenues to fall significantly, in particular corporate revenues. Second, by a wide variety of metrics, TCJA had what appears to be a weak effect on investment, jobs, median wages, business startups, et cetera. This evidence from TCJA is consistent with a long line of research, including work from leading Republican economist, the late Martin Feldstein, showing that tax cuts over the last 40 years have not had big impacts on the growth rate of the economy. What can policymakers do? Well, basically the proposals I mentioned at the beginning of my testimony would increase tax revenues on high-income households without hurting the economy. The revenues could be used to reduce economic disparities. That concludes my testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gale. Professor Brown, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for inviting me to share my views on the role of tax policy in increasing racial and economic disparities. I will explain how the joint return that makes no mention of race can nevertheless cause white married couples to get tax cuts that black married couples do not. I went into tax law to get away from race. Growing up in the South Bronx and experiencing racism made me want to practice a type of law that had nothing to do with race, and I thought that was tax law. As I write in my book, The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It, I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. My journey begins with preparing my parents' tax returns. My mother was a nurse and my father was a plumber. Their tax returns were straightforward, yet I always remember two things. My mother and father earned almost identical amounts of wages, and I always felt in my gut that my parents were paying too much in taxes. The latter was a mystery I would only figure out because I became a law professor. One afternoon in the early 1990s, I read an article by a mentor that asked, "To what extent have our tax laws been distorted by racism?" In that moment, I decided to look. My quest almost ended there because I discovered that the IRS did not publish statistics by race. I had to become a detective and eventually analyze Census Bureau data that showed married black couples were mainly like my parents, the Browns, contributing roughly equal amounts to household income. White married couples were more likely to live in single wage earner households, and the joint return treats those marriages very differently. Equal wage earner couples pay higher taxes, and single wage earner couples get a tax cut. Yet the joint return says nothing about race. Once we understand how the joint return became law and which couples it was designed to benefit, we will begin to understand why black married couples have been left behind and why, over time, so have an increasing number of white married couples. At the beginning of our progressive income tax system, only the richest Americans paid taxes. And even though there was nothing in our tax laws that said only rich white Americans pay taxes, that is how the law operated. In the beginning, there was also no such thing as a joint return. By 1927, roughly 5% of the richest Americans paid taxes, and one of those taxpayers was a white man named Henry Seaborn from the state of Washington. He and his tax advisors came up with a scheme to cut his tax bill. Henry, who was the sole breadwinner, treated half of his income as belonging to his stay-at-home wife, Charlotte, and the other half as his. The IRS disagreed, and the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Seaborns won. The court reasoned that because Washington was a community property state, Charlotte was legally entitled to half. There was also Supreme Court precedent that if a couple lived in a separate property state, they were denied this loophole. Rich white taxpayers living in separate property states lobbied Congress, which enacted the joint return in 1948. The joint return was designed for the Henry and Charlotte Seaborns, white married couples who live off of the income of a single wage earner. Most black married couples and an increasing percentage of white married couples either cannot or do not make that choice, and as a result are left out of tax subsidies for marriage. It is not just the joint tax return where we see racial disparities in the operation of our tax laws. In The Whiteness of Wealth, I discuss many other areas where our federal tax policies disadvantage taxpayers based upon race. My proposal of a wealth tax credit that would apply to all taxpayers in low-wealth households could begin the process of making the code more equitable. By ignoring race and class during tax policy discussions, we are working to maintain the status quo of economic inequality, where the richest among us pay the least. That results in taxpayers like the Seaborns winning and those like the Browns losing. We also miss an opportunity to highlight the common ground that many taxpayers have across racial and ethnic lines. We can and should use race and tax data to create tax policy that is good for the many and not the few. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Brown. Mr. Hanlon, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here to discuss the tax code and, in particular, tax fairness. I'd like to emphasize 3 points that I elaborate further in my written testimony. Number one, tax expenditures, the many special provisions of the code, are, on the whole, skewed toward the wealthy. Number two, recent tax changes, and in particular the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, have disproportionately benefited people with high incomes. Number three, tax fairness depends not only on the tax code, but how it is administered. And the IRS, in its current state, simply can't do its job. So the first point on tax expenditures. The most prominent examples of how the tax expenditures are skewed to the wealthy are the ways in which the income tax favors income from wealth. Capital gains, income from the appreciation of assets, are tax favored in 3 fundamental ways. First, unlike wages and salaries, where taxes are withheld in real time, taxes on capital gains are not due until and unless assets are sold, so taxes can be deferred for long periods. Second, an enormous amount of capital gains escapes income tax entirely through the tax loophole known as stepped-up basis. When assets are passed on to heirs, all capital gains tax liability is wiped out. Third, when assets that have grown in value and held for at least for a year are sold, they are taxed at the lower capital gains rates. Many tax expenditures are also upside down because they are designed in a way to give the biggest benefit to people in the highest tax brackets. So, for example, 88% of the new pass-through business deduction goes to people in the top quintile and fully half to the top 1%. The top quintile receives 63% of the benefit from retirement tax subsidies, and the bottom quintile gets only 13%. To be sure, there are important tax expenditures like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. But on the whole, the $1.6 trillion tax expenditure budget is skewed to people with higher incomes. My second point on recent tax changes. So TCJA, the 2017 tax law, gave far larger tax cuts to high-income people than to middle-class or working people. The average tax cut for people making more than $1 million was about $70,000, 122 times bigger than the average tax cut for people making between $40,000 and $50,000. These are estimates from the Tax Policy Center. The tax cuts were also bigger at the top relative to incomes. So in percentage terms, the after-tax incomes of the richest 1% went up by 3.4%. That's more than twice as much as the middle quintile. In percentage terms, the after-tax income of the people in the 95th to 99th percentile went up the most, followed by the top 1%, and then every other income group in descending order. This resulted from several features of the law. First, TCJA lowered the tax rates, including the top rate from 39.6% to 37%, and increased the AMT exemption. Second, it introduced the new pass-through business deduction, half the benefit of which goes to the top 1%. Third, it raised the estate tax exemption, so now only about 1,900 estates in the entire country, or the wealthiest 1 in every 1,400, pay it. And fourth, and finally, it slashed corporate taxes. The corporate rate went from 35% to 21%, a massive and immediate corporate tax cut. It introduced a territorial tax system with a weak minimum tax with a rate that is half the domestic corporate tax rates. The law had provisions to offset these tax cuts, but many were designed not to come into effect until several years after enactment. Congress has already delayed some of them further, and now the corporations that received tax cuts in 2017 are lobbying to stave off more, including the amortization of R&D expenses. TCJA drained revenue an estimated $1.9 trillion over its first decade, which would be more if its provisions are extended. So if one looks at the tax changes themselves, but also the financing of those tax cuts, the law is even more regressive. And finally, I'd like to discuss what's happened to the IRS, which has simply been decimated by budget cuts. The IRS has lost nearly 40% of its revenue agents, the experienced agents capable of thoroughly auditing complex tax returns. And as a result, audit rates have fallen the sharpest for millionaires and corporations. The IRS has focused a larger share of its audits on EITC recipients, despite the EITC representing only 6% of the tax gap. This has had disparate effects on Black and Hispanic families, on households headed by women, and in some areas of the country more than others. And the IRS technology is badly outdated, and the IRS is simply not providing adequate service to taxpayers. Fortunately, the House has passed legislation that will address many of these issues in the Budget Reconciliation Bill, and it has a golden opportunity to make the tax code more fair, and in so doing, foster inclusive economic growth.
Thank you, Mr. Hanlon. Ms. Matui, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My testimony today will address the importance of refundable tax credits to families with low and moderate incomes, families headed by women, and households of color. Refundable tax credits ensure equitable access to tax benefits and improve families' economic security. Many tax provisions, including those intended to encourage home ownership or retirement savings, or to help families afford the child care they need to work, are structured in ways that overwhelmingly benefit higher income tax filers and exclude low and moderate income tax filers. In particular, lower income households are less able to access tax benefits in the form of itemized deductions, exclusions from taxable income, or non-refundable credits. Women supporting families on their own and households of color are underrepresented among households with higher incomes and overrepresented among those with lower incomes. Combined with historical disparities in housing, employment, access to high-quality affordable childcare, and more, the inequitable distribution of tax benefits amplifies and reinforces gender and racial inequities. In contrast, refundable tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit are well targeted to families with lower incomes. They especially benefit women of color who predominate in low-paid jobs like childcare and home care workers, retail, and hospitality. Refundable tax credits help reduce the harsh economic effects of gender and racial discrimination by narrowing wage gaps, improving health, education, and future employment outcomes for children, and reducing poverty. The American Rescue Plan Act made temporary expansions to the Child Tax Credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit for low-paid workers not claiming children, and also the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. The expansions were intended to assist the tax filers most in need of support during the recession. For example, families used advance payments from the expanded CTC to pay for food and other necessities, catch up on bills, and replenish their savings. Families reported that the payments reduced their financial stress and enabled them to work more hours. The payments dramatically reduced monthly poverty rates for children, especially Black and Latinx children, from July to December 2021. The expanded EITC for workers not claiming children meant that workers with low wages, including many essential workers, were not taxed into poverty in 2021. The expanded credit benefited over 17 million workers, including 2.8 million Black workers, 2.8 million Latinx workers, and over 670,000 Asian workers. And the expansions to the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, which included making the credit refundable, meant that many families received assistance through the tax code for their out-of-pocket childcare costs for the first time in 2021. Importantly, those expansions shifted the distribution of the credit's benefits away from the highest income tax filers toward more low and moderate income families. While the recession's officially over, the deep inequities women faced before the pandemic persist and in many cases have worsened. We should not be satisfied by a return to an inequitable status quo when women, especially women of color, are lagging behind in the recovery and continue to experience material hardship. Congress should take the opportunity to unlock the potential of the tax code to advance economic, gender, and racial equity. First, the American Rescue Plan's expansions to the CTC, EITC, and Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit were needed before the pandemic, and the need persists now that they have expired. Congress should build on their success and make them permanent. Second, policymakers should re-examine other tax provisions, like the mortgage interest deduction and tax expenditures for retirement savings. They should ensure that tax benefits can be accessed by low and moderate income families and complement direct assistance. Third, Congress should take steps to ensure that the wealthy and big corporations pay their fair share of taxes. This would increase fairness in the tax code and raise revenues to make significant, long overdue public investments in the care infrastructure, affordable and accessible housing, and other supports that enable women of color and women more generally to succeed in our economy. Finally, Congress should restore and increase IRS funding so that the agency can effectively administer tax benefits and equitably enforce the tax laws. Especially if paired with significant public investments, such tax policy changes could increase fairness, advance equity, and support sustained and broadly shared prosperity. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Matsui. Dr. Rashidi, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stiles, and members of the Select Committee for having me here today. My name is Angela Rashidi, and I am a Senior Fellow in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where I have spent the past several years studying the federal safety net and its effectiveness in helping low-income families escape poverty. My research and the broader evidence base suggests that there are three things crucial to reducing poverty: education, employment, and marriage. My testimony today will cover tax policy within the context of the social safety net, including how child-related tax credits affect employment and fit into the broader strategy to reduce poverty and increase upward mobility for U.S. families. I want to make 3 key points. First, tax policy plays a very important role in the safety net for low-income families. They receive over $100 billion in refundable tax credits in the average year through the tax code. Second, working families need tax relief, not tax policies that undermine employment. And third, Congress should consider reforms that reduce taxes, strengthen the connection to employment for low-income families, reduce marriage penalties, and are simple and straightforward to implement. One of the primary ways for families to escape poverty and move up the income ladder is employment. Yet our current federal safety net encompasses a patchwork of over 80 programs and services, many of which discourage work. Programs disincentivize work in 2 possible ways. The first is when government assistance replaces the need for employment. The other is when recipients lose government benefits as their earnings increase, thereby reducing their incentive to work more. Decades of research show that government assistance programs reduce employment in these ways. I mention these dynamics because employment is crucial for families to escape poverty. Not only does it provide income, which supports material well-being, but employment also provides non-financial benefits for parents that translate to children, such as social capital and better health. The financial and non-financial benefits of employment improve the short-term material well-being for families, but it also creates opportunity for long-term prosperity. One bright spot in the safety net in recent decades has been the EITC, which provides a lump sum payment to low-income working families based on the number of children in the household. Research shows that the EITC encourages employment among low-income single-parent families and improves child well-being. This is because the EITC is available to parents who work, and the benefit amount phases in as earnings increase. This design offsets some, but not all, of the work disincentives in other parts of the safety net. The refundable portion of the child tax credit, or CTC, after it returned to its original design this year, is also only available to working families, which lessens potential negative employment effects. In contrast, research suggested that the temporary expansion of the CTC last year, which gave benefits to non-working families and eliminated the phase-in, would have decreased employment from anywhere between 400,000 to 1.5 million jobs had it been made permanent. Beyond the EITC and the CTC, the safety net contains many other aspects that can reduce employment for low-income families. For example, research shows that food assistance and housing assistance programs reduce employment because there is no requirement that parents work in order to be eligible. There is also evidence that benefit cliffs in Medicaid discourage employment. I will end with a few broad principles when thinking about how to better serve low-income families through tax policy. Poor families will be better off with employment, and maintaining the historical focus of tax relief for working families will increase work. Second, reforms should reduce penalties embedded in safety net programs. This includes marriage penalties. Ensuring that tax credits like the EITC encourage stable family formation is crucial for alleviating poverty and promoting upward mobility. Finally, refundable tax credit programs must operate with integrity. The rules and eligibility requirements must be straightforward and easy to implement. The greatest challenge for anti-poverty policy today is not assembling policies that transfer more money to poor families. Rather, the difficulty resides in how government policies can help more low-income families chart a path upward through employment and marriage. Reforming refundable child tax credits with these principles in mind give families a better chance at success. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rashidi. I now recognize myself for questions. So I was thrilled to hear my friend, the ranking member, say we've got to work on a more worker-oriented, work-friendly tax code. Because as my opening statement indicated, today you get one heck of a reward for not working. If I'm in a big house collecting dividends on daddy's fortune, I pay half the rate, 20%, that I pay if I go to work every day and work hard. That just, I don't need to elaborate on why that offends the sense of fairness that I think most Americans feel. But my question is there a public purpose there? And again, I alluded to this in the opening statement. If you tell me that dramatically preferential rates for yield on capital, investment, substantially increases investment and therefore creates more aggregate growth, I might say, okay, we'll violate our sense of fairness because it leads to more growth. Dr. Gale, you said that that's not the case. So if I were inclined to disagree with you, what would I point to? Is there evidence out there? You quoted Marty Feldstein, my freshman economics professor. He's a pretty conservative guy, and he said, no, there really is no argument that these preferential rates actually serve any real purpose other than to make our tax code unfriendly to workers. So what's out there that suggests that there is a public purpose to this?
Thank you. I think there's a preponderance of evidence from recent tax reforms, and you can tell how old I am by I think of the 1981 tax cut as a recent tax cut. But if you started 2017, there was a massive cut in the corporate rate. There was an extension of expensing for equipment investment. But investment in non-oil, non-mining industries didn't go up by very much. It didn't go up by any faster than it did before TCJA. Investment in oil and mining did, but that's because the price of oil went up. So you have these massive changes in 2017 that invoked very little impact on investment. Go back to 2001, the 2003 tax cuts where we reduced estate taxes and dividend and capital gains taxes. There was no increase in growth from 01 to 07 relative to earlier years. In fact, the economy grew less than during the 90s. And in the 90s, of course, we raised the top tax rate from 31 to 39.6%. There's an enormous amount of ideology here and very little evidence that these capital income tax cuts are generating the growth that people want them to.
Okay, thank you. I've got a lot of intellectual firepower in front of me here today. 4 other people, including somebody, thank you for being here, from the American Enterprise Institute. Does anybody want to make the case that dramatically different marginal tax rates on dividends, interest, and capital gains is actually substantially contributing to economic growth? Anybody? Going once, going twice, okay. The 4 most boring words in the English language are step up in basis. But it's a pretty fascinating thing, and let me see if I can get this right. If daddy dies and leaves me $100 million in stock that comes from a business that he built from nothing, so if he sold it, he would pay a pretty substantial capital gains, 20, although we've decided that maybe there's some preference there. He would pay a pretty big capital gains, 20% on that 100 million capital gain. But if he dies and I inherit it, I pay nothing. So again, I've got a lot of assembled brain power here. What public purpose is served by me getting to inherit daddy's stock on an entirely tax-free basis? Mr. Hanlon, anybody? Is there a public purpose to that?
I think it's more of a political thing. Originally, it was probably a tax administration issue that it was hard to figure out the basis, but there are easy ways to do that now. You could create a standard basis to say that's.
But by the way, let me interrupt you quickly here. What percentage of Americans are actually going to take advantage of the step up in basis? Anybody got an estimate?
Something like 75% of the gains or capital gains preferences go to the top 1%.
Okay, so 75% of the benefit from step up in basis, which again are boring words, but it basically means I get to inherit daddy's fortune with no tax, is going to go to the top 1%. And there no public purpose for that? Okay, all right, thank you. Dr. Rashidi, I want to just, my last question. I really appreciate your idea and your testimony here, and the ranking member really highlighted this. We don't want disincentives to work. We don't want disincentives to work in the tax code. When we had this fight, I learned that an awful lot of caregivers are, grandma taking care of grandkids. How do you, first of all, so I have two questions. One, and I'm going to ask this to the panel. You call the current CTC a child allowance. My understanding is that child allowance is a pretty conventional thing, particularly in Europe. So my question to the panel is there evidence that in fact there is a disincentive to work associated with a child allowance or the current structure of the child tax credit? And then, Dr. Rashidi, I take your point, but how do we deal with lots of people who I think we would argue because they're handicapped or elderly or whatever else shouldn't be compelled to work because they volunteer to take care of kids? But let's start with the broader question. Is there ample evidence that there is in fact a disincentive to work associated with a child allowance?
Chairman, I'm happy to start. So I will just mention that there was a study done in April 2022 that looked at the 6 months of advance payments of the CTC over 6 months in 2021 and found very little, if any, difference between families who received the CTC and families that did not. And anecdotally, families who received the CTC advance payments said that those payments helped them actually work more. This could be because it helped them afford transportation or gas. Many families ended up using that for childcare payments, although I will note that the CTC monthly payments were not sufficient to meet the full costs of childcare that most families have to pay to work. But the evidence from the 2021 advance payments does not indicate that there was a work disincentive, and the evidence is similar from child allowances in Canada.
Okay. Dr. Rashidi, is that evidence wrong, or are we missing something here?
Well, you would not expect to have a reduction in employment based on a temporary 6-month policy. So I think that what we found from the temporary expansion of the CTC is really irrelevant in this discussion. Related to Canada, there were negative employment effects among married families, and I think the evidence is a little bit more mixed on the child allowance issue. Looking more broadly, though, if we assume that the EITC encouraged employment because of the way it was structured in terms of phase-ins and only being provided to working people, it's not clear why we would not expect a similar policy like the CTC, if we eliminated those phase-ins, would not have a negative reduction on employment.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add? Oh, sorry.
Okay. Is the ranking member coming back?
Pass to Arrington, Financial Services.
Okay, I'm sorry. We've got votes in a variety of committees, so it's getting a little chaotic here. With that, I'll recognize Mr. Arrington for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I was wanting to answer the question about stepped-up basis that you posed to the panel. In fact, let's be clear. Daddy worked his butt off, paid sales tax and franchise tax, income tax, both federal and state, property taxes, which we don't have an income tax in Texas, but we have a pretty hefty property tax. So Daddy worked hard, and he earned it, and he paid taxes on it. And what you'll have for farmers, I can speak to farmers, Mr. Chairman, if they had to pay the unrealized gains of those assets at the point of transfer, you would have the largest liquidation of farming and ranching assets in the history of our country, if not the world. I mean, so I think it's unfair, un-American, and I think it would devastate the agriculture economy in the United States. So I didn't hear any response from the panel, but coming from West Texas, where we produce the preponderance of food and fiber for our nation, if not the world, there's an important deleterious effect, significant adverse impact on agriculture. So yeah, Daddy worked hard, Daddy paid lots of taxes all the way through the transfer. And there aren't many, farmers are cash poor. They can't afford to pay the taxes on the unrealized gains. They would sell the farm. Listen, that principle is so well understood by even the Democrat Party that they took out the repeal of the stepped-up basis, just negotiating with Democrats on the Build Back Better. So that question's been answered by Jimmy Panetta and others who understand agriculture. Now, let me ask you, Mr. Hanlon. Thank you for your comments and your testimony. You talked about the wealthy paying their fair share and wealthy benefiting from the tax code. Do you support the salt cap deduction being raised, whereby 50% of this is the Build Back Better provision, the Democrats, complete partisan vote, zero Republican support, but they raised the salt deduction. 50% of that's going to go to millionaires. 96% will go in the top quintile. 4% will be a benefit accrued to middle class. Do you support that provision? Because I'm trying to reconcile, at what point do you think the rich are getting richer off the tax code?
So the bill as a whole raises taxes on the top 1%.
No, I'm not. I'm just talking about that
No, I know.
provision, if you would.
Yeah.
Just in the interest of time.
I've written that I don't believe that raising the salt cap entirely it should be a priority in this reconciliation bill. I think there are much.
We don't either. I appreciate the feedback. Just in the interest of time, we don't either. I don't get it, but because again, Republicans aren't even at the table on this deal. Do you think, I hear a lot about fairness? And I just want to get your take, as fairness may be in the eye of the beholder, is from my experience up here. But when the top 1% of income earners are paying 40% of the taxes in this country, is that fair to the top 1%? Should they pay more? What about the top 10? The top 10% are paying 70% of our taxes. 40%, roughly, are paying no federal income tax liability. They get the benefit of the national defense, the infrastructure, but no real ownership in that. We have the most progressive tax code among any OECD nation. That means we're taxing the rich a whole lot more than we're taxing folks on the lower income. So these are rhetorical. I don't have much time. When we reduce the tax burden on job creators and individuals and working families, with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, 6 million people were lifted out of poverty, the lowest poverty rate in the history of our country. The median household income rose at a higher rate than in all of history, about $4,300 plus in real wage increase. We had the lowest unemployment rate for minorities and women. So and by the way, the tax code got more progressive under the Republican tax cuts, believe it or not. So I know I've gone over my time, Mr. Chairman. I'll just stop there.
Gentleman's time is
thanks for your response.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jayapal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I actually come from the state of Washington, where the lowest incomes pay 6 times more in taxes than the 1%. We have the most regressive tax system in the country. And I'm sorry to hear Professor Brown point to the other stain on our history with Mr. Seaborn and his efforts to reduce his taxes even further. Nationally, the 25 richest billionaires have paid 98 times less in federal income taxes than the average taxpayer, despite holding 14.3 million times their wealth. And I think this is the point to my friend from Texas. You have to look at not just what people pay in taxes, but you also have to look at what they earn, and it is unsustainable for working class people to continue picking up the tab for tax breaks that the wealthy enjoy, in part due to the Republican Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Instead, I think it's appropriate that we consider the kind of tax proposals that we're talking about today that level the playing field and create a fairer economy. Professor Brown, I really appreciate your book, and it's been the basis of much of the discussion here in Washington State, actually, for how we address our regressive tax system. In your testimony, you point out that lower income and taxpayers of color are more likely to be audited by the IRS because they claim credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit. How does that impact the wealth gap between working families and the elite? And is it fair that these are actually the individuals that are getting audited the most when they have the least amount of money versus the very, very wealthiest at the top?
Well, obviously, it's unfair, and what it does to the wealth gap is it makes the wealthiest less likely to be audited, whereas low-income wage earners are more likely to be audited, which has significant race and class impacts.
And working families and communities of color typically generate their wealth from wages, which gets taxed because our tax code focuses on income. Professor Brown, what does that mean in terms of the groups that are left out of paying their fair share in taxes?
It means that highest income white Americans are the ones most likely to own stock and get income from stock that's subject at most to the 20% tax rate, whereas wage earners, which are disproportionately Black and Hispanic, are being taxed on every dollar of their income.
Thank you. Mr. Hanlon, let me follow up on that with you. The ultra wealthy avoid taxes by concealing their wealth in a diverse array of assets and with a big army of tax lawyers. To ensure that they pay their fair share, I've got a bill with Senator Warren called the Ultramillionaire Tax Act that would enact just a 2% tax on the top 0.05% of the wealthiest households. And as we like to say, your first 50 million is free and clear in my bill. The audit rate for the wealthiest Americans fell from 21% to 3% over the last decade. And in the next decade, tax evasion will cost the IRS $7 trillion in revenue, which is money that could reduce expenses for families through providing affordable childcare or lowering prescription drug costs. Why are the audit rates for the wealthiest declining, and what do we do about it?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think the basic reason is that the IRS has been stripped of resources to adequately and thoroughly audit the wealthy and corporations. They've lost about 40% of their revenue agents, and those are the trained and experienced personnel who can actually do the very complex audits that of the wealthy and corporations. This is what the IRS Commissioner himself has said, that they simply don't have the people, the bodies, to go after, to do this work. And as a result, as Professor Brown was discussing, they've shifted a greater share of their audit resources onto EITC recipients who are very cheap from the IRS's perspective to audit because they can do it by mail. And that's been had very disparate effects by income and by race. So what can be done about it? Well, the budget reconciliation bill provides substantial multi-year funding for the IRS, $80 billion over 10 years, with those resources directed specifically towards auditing high-income individuals and corporations.
So important. My time has expired, and I just think it's important that we think about both the focus of any resources we have and the amount of resources that we have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We've heard a lot today. I think it's a productive conversation. I just want to go rapid fire down the line. Mr. Gale, do you believe our tax code is skewed to the wealthy, yes or no? Is the federal tax code skewed to the wealthy?
Many aspects of it are, yes.
Ms. Brown?
Yes.
Hamlin?
I think it's skewed to the very, very wealthy.
The very, very wealthy. Ms. Hui?
Yes, in terms of many provisions, yes.
Dr. Rashidi?
Well, in some ways, yes, but I think we missed the point, too, that 40% of the bottom of the income distribution don't pay income taxes at all. So to factor in that in.
No, that's a helpful note. So let me come back to the four who've noted it's, in their opinion, skewed to the wealthy. What if I came to you with a tax proposal that cost $285 billion, and of that tax proposal, 20%, or I apologize, 96% of the relief would go to the top 20% income earners. So I'm going to, you've just noted, all four of you, it's a skewed tax code in your opinion. I present to you an idea that is going to be 96% of the benefits going to go to the top 20%. Would that further skew the tax code in favor of the wealthy? Mr. Gale?
I don't have these numbers in my head.
Okay, you don't know. Ms.
I don't
Brown?
know.
Oh, you don't know. All right, Ms. Hanlon? Mr. Hanlon,
It
sorry.
depends on the broader legislation it's contained in, but in
Interesting.
isolation, yes.
In isolation, yes. That's an honest answer.
I'll just add that the tax code doesn't operate in isolation. It's on top
Okay,
of
okay, so a lot, what I'm going to view there is a lot of dancing, because we saw last year a proposal on a single-party vote to increase the SALT tax deduction, voted by every Democratic member of this committee, to the best of my knowledge, passed in a partisan process that took $285 billion. I think the real cost is closer to $340 billion. We could nit and nat. What's billions amongst friends? We could nit and nat that, but the benefit would be skewed to the wealthiest. So I think there's a lot of richness in some of the comments that we're hearing here, where the Democrats' most expensive provision of Build Back Better would take tax benefits and skew it to the wealthiest. Because I think the Trump tax cuts actually generated significant economic growth across the board, and some of the greatest benefits of that were felt by the least amongst us. Real wages were growing across the board prior to the pandemic, and uniquely, the median real wage growth was most significant among some of the least amongst us, and in particular, blacks and Hispanics. And so I think we need to reflect upon the empirical data in the real world versus sometimes just the hypothetical approach that's being offered to us. I want to jump in, though, because I think, Dr. Rashidi, your research in particular on the child tax credit, on the earned income tax credit, in how those changes occurred at the start of the Biden administration. I think rarely in world history have we seen such a juxtaposition between policies from one administration to the next, in particular on domestic economic policy. What was the real world implications of pulling away the connection of employment as relates to those two key provisions?
Well, I think the main concern with making the CTC fully refundable, meaning it went to non-working families, was that it would disincentivize employment over the long term. And part of why scholars like myself were concerned is because we have studied the AFDC program, which was the cash welfare program prior to our current program, TANF, which in many ways was a kind of child allowance for very poor families with children. And it was the consensus, a bipartisan consensus, that program very much disincentivized work, reduced work among the most vulnerable families, which were largely single mother families, and did not result in better outcomes for those families. And so with the onset of welfare reform in '96, we have quite a bit of evidence to suggest that it increased employment greatly, and I would argue that the bulk of the evidence suggests that has been positive for single mother families and their children over time. So the concern in moving moving back to an AFDC type approach in how to reduce poverty, I think raises a lot of concerns, mainly because it does disconnect our government programs from employment.
And did you see a reduction in the participation rate in employment or the employment numbers as the child tax credit was disconnected from work?
Well, so that's a difficult empirical question to ask. One, it's hard to control for all other things that were going on at the time. And also, just from an economic theory perspective, a temporary policy that families know is temporary and is going to end eventually, we wouldn't expect that to change behavior. So I wouldn't even look at short-term changes in employment as an effectiveness measure of that policy. We would need much more time to do that.
Thank you. If I can, Mr. Chairman, if I have one more minute or so, I'll be tight on it. We hear a lot about people paying their fair share. We're policymakers. We actually set rates and numbers. Mr. Gill, do you have a percentage of income that should be paid that would be a fair share? A percentage, a number?
I think the issue there is what's counted as income. And if
But do you have a number, right? So we could debate that. But you can have earned income, you have unearned income. Is there a rate number?
I have my own number, sure, but
what
again,
would that be?
I think top households should pay 40 to 50% of their appropriately defined income.
40 to 50% federally is fair share.
Yeah, including unrealized capital gains.
Appreciate it, Dr. Brown. Do you have a number that is the fair share?
In a progressive tax rate system?
Sure.
I would say there isn't a single number.
But let's take the billionaires, the uber wealthy that we were talking about earlier.
40 to 50. I mean, historically, we've had as high as 70%. So 40 to 50 looks like
40
a tax cut.
40 to 50% federally. Ms. Hanlon?
I don't have a preferred
Mr. Hanlon,
number.
apologize.
Sorry. Yeah, it's fine. I would just say that I think it depends on the pre-tax distribution of income as well, and our country is extremely unequal.
But right now, right, empirical data today, we are the decision makers. We can actually set tax rates. You are in the United States Congress. This is the federal government. Tomorrow, this committee could release a report that says, here's the fair rate. Mr. Gale said 40 to 50%. Dr. Brown said 40 to 50%. You, Mr. Hanlon, do you have a number? You can say you don't have a number.
I don't have a number, but I do agree with the focus on effective tax rates on income defined comprehensively.
Okay. Ms. Matsui.
I don't have a number for a tax rate, and I think it also depends on the different preferences and provisions in the tax code.
I don't know if we're going to sit around and talk about paying fair share. You guys should, with all due respect in your research, and you don't have to do it today, I'd love you to submit for the record, what is the fair share? Because we hear a lot about it. It'd be great if somebody came forward and just said, here's the fair share. You should pay 50% of your income. You should pay 90% of your income. Tell me, I'd just be open to the dialogue, because it's easy to say fair share. It's hard to put a number on it, and I think it's sometimes we have conversations here that are in the abstract rather than in the definitive. I appreciate everybody's time, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, and thanks for highlighting something that maybe we can agree on. I think we're talking about the wrong thing. We're talking about how to fix a system, frankly, it seems like everyone at the table says doesn't work, which is the income tax, which is why I've got a constitutional amendment proposed to repeal the 16th Amendment, which established this broken system of taxation. It doesn't work well. And so thank you for highlighting many of the ways that it doesn't work. Jeff Bezos isn't going to sell his Amazon shares anytime soon. And some people think that's unfair. You should pay as if you had sold them. So you won't have to necessarily give up control of the company as long as we can confiscate some of the wealth. That's the concept behind the wealth tax, right? But the reality is, if we tax differently, instead of paying almost nothing on it, instead of being able to borrow, frankly, at lower rates than the federal government, because there's even lower risk that he's going to default on, say, 50% of the value of his Amazon shares than the federal government defaulting on a 10-year Treasury note in the current environment. He could probably borrow more cheaply than the United States government right now. And that's rational. What's not rational is to continue to fight and bicker and divide our country over class warfare schemes when we know that the current system of income tax really doesn't work well. It does leave out people like Jeff Bezos. But if we had a fair tax, a system that instead of taxing income, taxed consumption, but allowed for basic needs to be excluded from taxation, things that the lowest income people pay disproportionately high percentage of their income in, it would work more fairly, and it would be incredibly more progressive. I mean, I'm speculating here because I don't really know, but I'm thinking Jeff Bezos probably pays more for lawn care than the median household income. Right? So you could tax all sorts of consumption and tax differently, and it could be more fair, more equitable, and it would, frankly, be more efficient. You know, my main objection isn't even relevant to the topic at hand. My main objection is privacy. You know, did you make some money? Did you give someone a gift? You know, did you buy or sell something? Did you make or lose money? It's really not the government's business to know that. It's just an incredible invasion of privacy. And that's what we're seeing is it's really a tool of power. It's a tool of coercion, a way to impose the will of the government on the population. And so for all those reasons, we should have more freedom and less government, and we should actually get to one of the root issues that also divides us, which is sound money. So I'm going to go down the table real quickly and say, you know, do deficits matter? So, Mr. Gale, do deficits matter?
Right now, they matter less than they have in the past, and
I'll take that as a
probably
no.
less than they have in the future.
Professor Brown?
No.
Mr. Hanley?
Very little at the moment.
Okay. Ms. Matsui?
They shouldn't constrain investments that are needed.
No? Okay.
Yes, they matter.
Okay, so I think we've had a little sample pack of modern monetary theory, which is a new phrase for an old idea that you can debase the currency, that deficits don't matter. You know, we have our own currency, so we could just print more money. Why would we even need to tax? Since deficits don't matter, why do we need to collect taxes? Is it just because we hate rich people? Anyone? So if deficits don't matter, why tax?
We're not collecting taxes from really rich people.
From anybody?
We are collecting taxes from middle class and low income Americans.
So we shouldn't tax anybody and we could just spend?
We should tax rich Americans more so that they pay their fair share to compensate for their use of the court system and any number of other.
Okay, so fundamentally, really just to punish the rich. The really, really rich is the only reason we should tax, right? And then we could redistribute. But why redistribute when you can even just print the money? So this is a fallacious argument. We're seeing the results of it. And people say, well, we're seeing it around the world. Well, we're seeing it around the world because other countries have debased their currency more aggressively than the United States of America. The European Union, European Central Bank, they've printed more money as a percentage of their GDP than we have. Bank of Japan, Swiss National Bank, they've all debased their currencies, and so it's growing the wealth gap. Why? Well, to your point, some of you have made the point, wealthy people own more equity. But here who would get crushed by some of these horrible ideas? Unrealized gains? Are you kidding me? What would happen to Mr. Himes' idea? I had a small business. We were not cash rich as a business. But if I had to sell my company to pay the estate tax, my family would have nothing because it would be sold. We'd pay taxes, and there'd be a little bit left over. Mr. Arrington highlighted what would happen in farms, but the reality is it makes it impossible to leave an inheritance. So the death tax is a horrible way to tax, an even worse way. So we have to come up with a better, more fair way to tax. We do have to collect revenue for our government, but I hope that this forms the basis for a huge momentum to get rid of the income tax. I yield.
Gentlemen's time is expired, and I'd like to thank, there's a floor vote on now, or I'd be tempted to do another round of questions because this is obviously an immensely complicated and important topic, and I think we surfaced some important things here today. My Republican colleagues pointed out that the unlimited SALT deduction would not, in fact, be progressive. They're not wrong about that. That also does not, therefore, mean that step-up in basis is not. So I hope that there is room for conversation here and coming out, in particular, as Ms. Rashidi said, making these tax preferences that actually do help lower-income people more efficient and valuable. But sadly, for such an immense topic, we do need to close the hearing because there are floor votes. So I'd like to thank our witnesses for the testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record, and I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email addresses provided to your offices. With that, I will thank all of our witnesses once again and adjourn the meeting.